Vietnam fought foreign invaders for over 1,000 years. The Chinese, then the French, then the Japanese, then the Americans. Entire generations lived and died without ever knowing what peace felt like, and yet somehow they won every single time. Before the story, if these help you sleep, like or subscribe would be cool. Also drop where you're listening from and the time. I check the comments and it's crazy seeing people from like Australia and Norway on the same video. Okay, tonight it's the Vietnam War, but from the Vietnamese perspective. Before we go anywhere, get cozy, like actually cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. Your eyes open to the faint glow of pre-dawn light filtering through bamboo walls. The first thing that hits you is the smell, a mixture of damp earth, wood smoke, and nuoc mam fish sauce drifting from a nearby pot. You're lying on a woven reed sleeping mat in rural North Vietnam, 1960. Your back aches from the hard surface, but unlike your soft modern mattress, this is considered a luxury in your village. Outside, roosters announce the morning with persistent crowing. Unlike your phone's gentle alarm, here the day begins with the sun, no exceptions. The thin cotton blanket does little against the morning chill, and dew has somehow found its way inside, making everything slightly damp. You're not alone. Family members sleep nearby on similar mats, the small thatched house containing 3 generations under one roof. Time to rise, an elderly voice calls softly. Grandmother is already up, stoking the cooking fire. The smoke finds its way through the house rather than up the crude chimney, creating a blue haze that stings your eyes. Everyone has the same slightly smoky smell embedded in their clothes and hair. There's no escaping it, not like your clean, air-freshened bedroom back home. The bamboo floor creaks as you rise, careful not to wake the younger children. Your first task of the day looms immediately, fetching water. Unlike your home where clean water appears magically from a tap, here you must walk 1/2 kilometre to the village well, carrying heavy bamboo containers back for the family's cooking and washing needs. This is life in a Vietnamese village, and despite what Americans would later believe, most villagers weren't thinking about communism versus capitalism or North versus South. They were thinking about survival, about rice, about family, about making it to another harvest. You know what makes this place so different from most countries. The old man who speaks is your grandfather, a weathered farmer with calloused hands and a bamboo hat frayed at the edges. We've spent more time fighting invaders than most countries have even existed. He's right, you realise. For most of its long history, Vietnam had been fighting off someone. First came China, which spent 1,000 years trying to absorb the nation through both conquest and cultural assimilation. This wasn't ancient history to the Vietnamese. The scars were still fresh, the stories passed down through generations. My father's father told him that our ancestors fought the Chinese for 1,000 years, grandfather says, his voice barely above a whisper as you walk together to the fields. Then came the French with their fancy guns and ships. The French. Even the word makes his face harden. By the 19th century, China was facing its own problems with European colonialism. With Chinese influence waning, Vietnam might have finally had a chance to stand on its own, but a small squadron of French warships crushed those hopes. I was a boy when the French ruled, he tells you. You think life is hard now. Back then, we weren't even people to them. We were tools, labour, not human. The French colonial governors operated with virtually no oversight, suppressing any hint of Vietnamese identity or resistance. Many Vietnamese weren't even allowed to identify themselves as Vietnamese. Imagine that, being punished for saying who you actually are. Like someone telling you that you're not allowed to be yourself anymore. Hey, Picture this, the old man says as you reach the rice paddy where today's work awaits. We couldn't even enter certain buildings. There were signs, no dogs, no Vietnamese. That's what they thought of us. Decades of failed revolts and horrific reprisals had left the Vietnamese peasantry desperate for some way out, any way out. Your grandfather explains how the iron grip of colonialism seemed unbreakable. The French had the guns, the money, the international recognition. What did the Vietnamese have? Rice paddies and bamboo. So how did things change, you ask, sinking ankle-deep into the muddy paddy as work begins? It wasn't the farmers who started it, he says with a hint of a smile. It was the educated ones, the ones who went to France. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. While the peasants struggled in the villages, the seeds of revolution were being planted thousands of miles away. In the coffee houses of Paris, the few Vietnamese lucky enough to scrape together enough money for a Western education began debating a strange new ideology that promised freedom and equality for those laboring under imperialism, communism. It spread like wildfire, your grandfather says, his eyes distant with memory. Not because people understood Marx or Lenin. Most couldn't read. They liked it because it was the first thing that promised us freedom from the French. Central to this movement was an unassuming man called Nguyen Sinh Cung, later known to the world as Ho Chi Minh. After leaving Vietnam sometime in the 1910s, he drifted around Europe, even visiting America. As early as 1918, he was a dedicated anti-imperialist, joining a group of Vietnamese patriots petitioning the French government for independence during the Treaty of Versailles. The Europeans ignored them, of course, your grandfather scoffs. They were busy dividing up the world among themselves. In 1920, Ho Chi Minh followed the progress of Vladimir Lenin's October Revolution in Russia. The success proved something vital to oppressed peoples everywhere. The imperialist system could be overthrown through force of arms. The sun climbs higher in the sky as you work the rice field. Your back aches, your hands blister, but there's no stopping. This is survival. Every grain matters. The work is relentless, but it gives you plenty of time to think about what grandfather is telling you. This history that Americans never learned. Ho Chi Minh wasn't just some communist, the old man continues during a brief water break. He was a nationalist first. He wanted Vietnam for Vietnamese. Inspired by Lenin's success, Ho Chi Minh chaired the first meeting of what would become the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930. Their express goal was ending colonial rule of Vietnam. You know what he used to say? Grandfather smiles. At first patriotism, not yet communism. But for all of Ho Chi Minh's early efforts, change in Vietnam wouldn't come from the Vietnamese themselves. It would come from the most unlikely source, Imperial Japan. The Japanese invaded in 1940, says grandfather. They came to establish what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. You can't help but laugh at the absurdity. Co-prosperity? Was there anything prosperous about it? Of course not, he chuckles. Just a fancy name for replacing European colonizers with Japanese ones. But something unexpected happened. When the Japanese kicked out the French, they accidentally created a power vacuum. In 1945, Japan officially annexed Vietnam and expelled all Western influences, including the entire French colonial administration. But mere months later, the Japanese surrendered to the Allies, and with their collapse, Vietnam's century-old political order came crashing down, leaving chaos in its wake. It was during this chaotic year that Ho Chi Minh truly emerged as a leader. He had returned to Vietnam in 1941 to organize a major resistance movement against Japanese forces known as the Viet Minh. By 1945, he was leading an army of at least 10,000 communist guerrillas. His revolution began on August 15th, grandfather says. Before the ink on the Japanese surrender had even dried, the French forces had been disarmed by the Japanese earlier that year, so there was a brief window where the Viet Minh had free run of the entire country. And they took over, you ask? Not exactly. What Ho Chi Minh did next surprised everyone. Instead of attacking the Western powers, he tried to befriend America. Wait, what? This isn't the story Americans were told about Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, the communist revolutionary, tried to be friends with the United States. It's true, grandfather insists. The American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, had made contact with the Viet Minh in 1945. They actually chose Ho Chi Minh as their primary contact within Vietnam. This close relationship between America and the Viet Minh was possible because, despite Ho Chi Minh's communist beliefs, his primary goal was always the liberation of Vietnam. This struck a chord with American observers who were sympathetic to the idea of an oppressed nation throwing off the shackles of a European colonial power. After all, wasn't that America's origin story too? When Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2nd, 1945, do you know how he began his speech? Grandfather asks. You shake your head. With words from the American Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Behind Ho Chi Minh on the podium that day stood OSS Major Archimedes Patty. As the speech came to a close, a plane bearing US markings flew over the assembled crowd, which greeted its appearance with thunderous applause. Americans were seen as heroes and liberators, and for a brief moment it seemed this would be the start of a glorious new relationship between East and West. My father was in Hanoi that day, grandfather says quietly. He said everyone cheered for the Americans. Everyone thought they would help us stay free. The midday sun beats down mercilessly as you continue working. Other villagers labour nearby, everyone bending at the waist in that distinctive pose of rice farmers worldwide. Children splash in the water, combining work with play. An old woman sings a folk song while planting seedlings. Despite the hardship, there's a sense of community here, of belonging. So what happened, you ask? Why didn't America support Vietnamese independence? Grandfather sighs deeply. The world change. Grandfather's voice trails off as a distant sound catches his attention. You both pause, water halfway up your shins in the rice paddy. In the distance, you hear the faint drone of an engine. His weathered face changes instantly, a mixture of fear and resignation. Aircraft, he says simply. Get down. But the plane passes overhead without incident, likely a reconnaissance flight rather than a bomber. Still, the momentary terror is something you'll never forget. That split second where your heart stops, where you wonder if this breath might be your last. This is daily life in Vietnam. The constant awareness that death could arrive from above at any moment. When your breathing returns to normal, grandfather continues his story. The French wanted their colonies back after World War II, he says, his hands never stopping their work in the mud. And the newly elected American President Truman, he had no interest in cooperating with an openly communist regime, no matter that we just wanted freedom. The brief window of possibility, that magical moment when Vietnam might have found an ally in America, slammed shut. After negotiations with the French broke down completely, the Vietnamese had no choice but to fight for their independence. The First Indochina War began on December 16, 1946. I was young but old enough to carry messages for the Viet Minh, grandfather says. The French brought in the puppet emperor Bao Dai, the 13th ruler of the Nguyen dynasty. He sided with them and resumed his place as a figurehead over their occupied territories. As you work, grandfather tells you about the years of grinding conflict, villages caught between opposing forces, families split apart by ideology and circumstance, children going hungry because the fighting disrupted planting seasons, the endless struggle just to survive. "You know what kept us going?" he asks, straightening his back for a moment. "Rice, this right here." He gestures to the green shoots emerging from the muddy water around you. "The French controlled the cities, but we controlled the countryside. And in Vietnam, whoever controls the rice eventually controls everything." As the war dragged on, the United States began sending aid to the French, but despite American weapons and money, the French colonial forces couldn't defeat the Vietnamese guerrillas who knew every trail, every cave, every mountain path in their homeland. The turning point came at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, grandfather says, his voice taking on a tone of pride. "You should have seen it. Our General Giap positioned artillery in the mountains surrounding the French base. The French commander thought it was impossible to get heavy guns up those steep slopes. How did they manage it? One piece at a time, thousands of people, old men, women, children, dismantled the artillery into parts small enough to carry. They hauled them up muddy mountain trails, sometimes on their backs. Then they reassembled them at the top, hidden from French aircraft." The image is vivid in your mind. Ordinary villagers, people just like those working alongside you in this rice field, performing an extraordinary feat through sheer determination and collective effort. When the Battle of Dien Bien Phu began, the French were shocked to find themselves under devastating artillery fire from the surrounding highlands. The French were so confident they'd brought journalists to witness their great victory, grandfather chuckles. Instead, those journalists watched their great defeat. After 56 days of siege, the French commander radioed his superiors. "We no longer have any organized position. The Viet Minh are everywhere." After their dramatic defeat, the French agreed to new negotiations. The ensuing treaty split the country in two halves, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the State of Vietnam in the south. But here's where it gets really interesting, grandfather says, lowering his voice, though there's no one nearby to overhear. Bao Dai was then unceremoniously ousted by his Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem after a referendum determined that the state of Vietnam should become a republic. Was that good, you ask, not fully grasping the politics? Good, grandfather snorts. The referendum was so blatantly rigged it was almost funny. In Saigon, there were more votes for Diem than there were registered voters. That's like having 12 people in a room, but counting 15 votes. Magic. The absurdity makes you laugh despite the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't democracy. This was theatre. But wait, it gets better. Grandfather continues. According to the Geneva Accords that ended the French War, the division of Vietnam was supposed to be temporary. The whole country was to hold free elections in 1956 to decide whether to reunify under the northern or southern government. Let me guess, you say. Those elections never happened. Oh, smart kid. Diem and his American backers knew that Ho Chi Minh would win any fair election. Ho was a national hero who'd fought against multiple foreign invaders. Diem was a Catholic in a Buddhist country who'd spent the war living comfortably in New Jersey. So Diem just ignored the agreement. By noon, the sun is directly overhead, brutally hot. There are no breaks in rice farming. The seedlings must be planted, the water levels maintained, the weeds removed. Your back screams in protest, but everyone around you continues working. A young woman passes by, carrying an infant on her back, the baby sleeping peacefully despite the heat and the mother's constant bending and straightening. Our meals weren't like yours today, grandfather says, nodding toward a group of children bringing lunch to the workers. Sometimes just rice, sometimes rice with a few vegetables. Meat was rare, a luxury for special occasions. During the worst fighting, we'd go days with barely enough to survive. The lunch arrives, a simple meal of rice with some fermented vegetables and a small amount of dried fish. The flavor is sharp and unfamiliar to your modern palate, but hunger makes it delicious. Everyone squats in the field margin, eating quickly, efficiently. No leisurely lunch breaks here. When it became obvious that Diem had no intention of allowing reunification, grandfather continues between mouthfuls, DRV-backed insurgents began appearing all over the south. These fighters eventually became known as the Viet Cong. I've heard of them, you say. In American movies, they're always the bad guys. Of course they are, he laughs, but to us they were heroes fighting against yet another corrupt government backed by foreign powers. Funny how that works, isn't it? Your heroes are someone else's villains. The insurgency made Diem increasingly paranoid and anti-communist, which in turn caused America to offer more and more aid to his administration. It was a cycle that would eventually pull the United States fully into the conflict. Diem was no prize, grandfather says with a grimace. He was utterly corrupt and refused to cooperate even with his American backers, especially on rural development and land reform. The Americans eventually realized he was more liability than asset. In 1963, tensions finally came to a head when Diem was assassinated in a military coup d'etat that was aided by the CIA. This, combined with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, paved the way for a full-scale American invasion. The Gulf of Tonkin, grandfather says, shaking his head in disbelief. The Americans claimed our torpedo boats attacked their destroyers without provocation, used it as an excuse to start bombing the north and send in ground troops. Years later, their own officials admitted it never happened the way they said. Afternoon brings no relief from the heat or the work. You're developing blisters on your hands from the constant labor. In the distance, you see smoke rising from a village, someone cooking, or perhaps something more sinister. It's hard to tell in a war zone. From the outset, grandfather continues, his voice growing more serious, Vietnamese generals knew that a conventional victory against America was impossible. You've seen American movies, right? Their tanks, planes, ships. No country in the world could match that firepower in a traditional battle. The enormity of what Vietnam faced sinks in. The United States was the most powerful military force in history. How could a small, poor, agricultural nation possibly hope to resist? But we had something they didn't, he says. This. He gestures to the land around you, to the people working in the fields. The huge rural population of the South was already mostly under the sway of the Viet Cong. We didn't need to win big battles, we just needed to survive. The Vietnamese defensive strategy evolved to counter American technological superiority. They built an extensive network of tunnels that many compared to underground cities rather than mere military strongholds. Over 200 miles of tunnel were dug during the war, with the largest system at Ho Chi being just 20 miles outside Saigon. My cousin helped dig those tunnels, grandfather says. Imagine using your hands and basic tools to dig through the earth, creating living spaces, storage rooms, even hospitals, all underground, and all while avoiding detection. Weren't they afraid of the tunnels collapsing? You ask. The thought making your chest tighten with claustrophobia. Of course, he nods, but they were more afraid of the bombs falling from the sky. Underground, at least you had a chance. The importance of these tunnel systems was summed up by a Vietnamese colonel named Chow Lam. "We knew the Americans were determined to find and destroy the tunnel system. They understood, as did we, however Ho Chi went, so did the war. It was our determination not to lose even 1 centimetre of the tunnels. It was a contest of wills resulting in some very fierce fighting. We made a tremendous sacrifice to gain victory." By late afternoon, you're exhausted beyond anything you've ever experienced. Your muscles burn, your skin is raw from sun and water, but no one else is stopping, so neither do you. The discipline required for this lifestyle is astonishing. Day after day, season after season, with no end in sight. 2 years after its arrival, grandfather says, as if reading your thoughts about endurance, the United States expanded its bombing campaigns across North Vietnam in an effort to break our will to fight. He tells you about a North Vietnamese civilian who saw the first B-57 bombers open their bomb bays over his home province of Quang Minh. His first thought wasn't to flee in panic, but instead, why is a mother airplane dropping baby airplanes? The observation is so unexpected, so innocently poetic amid the horror that you can't help but laugh. Grandfather joins you, and for a moment there's a strange kind of joy in this awful story. Having miraculously survived the initial attack, grandfather continues, he gathered his family and fled for the nearby caves. He later told a journalist, "People didn't talk about the meaning of the war. We were really confused why the Americans tried to invade our homeland. We hadn't done anything to them." As the shadows lengthen across the fields, grandfather's story takes an even darker turn. He explains how the civilian population had much more to fear than American bombs. When Viet Cong guerrillas went to ground among the rural peasantry, US forces responded by declaring any villages with a suspected VC presence as free fire zones. What does that mean, you ask, though part of you doesn't want to know? It means they could shoot anything that moved. Man, woman, child, water buffalo. Didn't matter. All considered enemies. His voice is flat, devoid of emotion, as if discussing the weather rather than atrocities. Then came what he calls the true horror, the My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968, when at least 347 unarmed civilians were brutally executed by American soldiers. Although the heroic actions of a US helicopter crew saved a few innocent lives, most were not so fortunate. My Lai would go on to become known as the worst war crime ever perpetrated by US soldiers in Vietnam. There were good Americans too, grandfather says, his face softening slightly. That helicopter pilot, Thompson was his name, he landed between the civilians and his own troops, pointed his machine guns at his fellow soldiers and said he'd shoot if they didn't stop the killing. The sun is setting now, casting long shadows across the rice fields. Workers are beginning to pack up their tools, heading back to the village after a day of back-breaking labour. You walk alongside grandfather on the narrow path between paddies, your body aching, your mind overwhelmed with the stories he shared. As traumatizing as the war was for the civilian population, he says quietly, as you near the village, it was arguably just as bad for the Vietnamese soldiers because of how long most were expected to serve on the front lines. He tells you about Lake Hao Dai, head of surgery at a military hospital, who recalled, "When we were called to go south, everyone was very excited. As it turned out, while I only planned to stay for 6 months, I ended up staying for 8 years. 8 years of constant combat, constant danger, constant fear. It's incomprehensible to your modern mind. Given these extended deployment times," grandfather continues, "Vietnamese soldiers quickly became hardened to the horrors of war and had little mercy for any Americans unfortunate enough to fall into their grasp." As darkness falls, oil lamps and cooking fires begin to glow in the village ahead. The smell of rice cooking mingles with wood smoke. Children's laughter echoes between the simple houses. Despite everything, life continues. People find moments of joy, of connection, of humanity. American pilots were especially loathed, grandfather says, his voice dropping to ensure no one else hears. Due to their indiscriminate bombing campaigns, many were tortured to death after they bailed out over Vietnamese territory. The brutal honesty makes you wince. There were no clean hands in this war, no side that could claim moral purity. Just people caught in an unimaginable conflict, trying to survive by whatever means necessary. As you reach the edge of the village, grandfather stops and turns to you, his silhouette dark against the last glow of twilight. Tomorrow, he says, I'll tell you about how the North Vietnamese kept their morale during the darkest days, about the propaganda that kept a nation fighting against the most powerful military in history, and about the turning point that began to shift the war in our favour. You nod, too exhausted for words, as you both head toward the small house where the rest of the family is preparing the evening meal. Despite your fatigue, your mind races with the day's stories, tales of courage and horror, of resistance and atrocity, of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. This was Vietnam in 1960, a nation at the precipice of a war that would define a generation, a conflict that began not with grand ideologies, but with something much simpler, the desire of a people to determine their own destiny after centuries of foreign domination. As you settle down for the night on your reed mat, the sounds of the village gradually quieting around you, you wonder what tomorrow's stories will bring. The war, you realise, is far from over. In fact, from grandfather's perspective in 1960, the worst is yet to come. Morning comes too soon, announced by roosters crowing and the smell of rice porridge cooking over the fire. Your body protests with every movement, muscles unaccustomed to yesterday's labour scream in protest. The reed mat left impressions on your skin, and your back feels like someone took a hammer to it during the night. But around you, the family is already moving, already preparing for another day of work. There are no sick days here, no calling out because you're sore. Survival doesn't wait. How did you sleep? Grandfather asks, noticing you're wincing as you sit up. Like I was hit by a truck, you admit, accepting a small bowl of rice porridge with a few green onions floating on top. He laughs, the sound surprisingly warm in the dim morning light. Your body will adjust. Mine did, over 70 years ago. After a quick breakfast, it's back to the fields. But today, as you walk the narrow paths between paddies, grandfather's story takes a different turn. To keep our populace motivated during the war, he explains, and to stave off the effects of war weariness, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam maintained strong propaganda campaigns throughout the conflict. You picture stern posters and blaring loudspeakers, the Cold War propaganda you've seen in movies, but grandfather paints a more nuanced picture. The mastermind behind these campaigns was Vo Nguyen Giap, he says. Not just a propaganda man, he was our greatest military leader, fighting alongside Ho Chi Minh since the 1940s. Giap had been a history teacher before becoming a revolutionary. He studied the campaigns of Napoleon and other military leaders, adapting their strategies to the Vietnamese context. But perhaps his greatest talent was understanding what kept people fighting when all hope seemed lost. People would form long lines to buy his newspapers, grandfather recalls. They'd gather around loudspeakers in village squares to hear the latest developments from the front. With minimal access to international news, the people of the North were easily influenced by the party's message. Was it all lies, you ask, genuinely curious? Not lies exactly, he says thoughtfully, more like selective truth. They told us about our victories, rarely our defeats. They reminded us constantly why we were fighting, not for communism, but for our homeland, to end centuries of foreign domination. As you bend to plant rice seedlings, Grandfather describes the propaganda that became part of daily life in the north. Posters showing brave Vietnamese soldiers standing tall against American aggressors, radio broadcasts celebrating small victories and the international support for Vietnam's cause, songs that children learned in school extolling the virtues of sacrifice for the nation. It worked because it connected to something real, he says. Nobody had to convince us that foreigners had been exploiting Vietnam for centuries. We lived it. Our parents lived it. Their parents lived it. By contrast, he explains, the urban population of the South could listen to foreign news reports and had a much more conflicted attitude towards the violence tearing apart their nation. In Saigon, you might see an American movie one day and hear about a Viet Cong attack the next. People didn't know what to believe, but in the north there was only one message: resist the invaders, unite the country, sacrifice today for freedom tomorrow. As the morning progresses, Grandfather tells you how propaganda permeated every aspect of life. Even the way houses were built reflected political considerations, simple, humble structures that showed no bourgeois tendencies. Clothing was basic and utilitarian. Luxury was considered not just unnecessary, but morally suspect. We had a saying, he recalls, better to eat poorly than to lose the country, better to die than to be enslaved. A water buffalo trudges past, led by a young boy who can't be more than 10. The massive beast could easily crush the child, yet it follows docilely, each knowing their role in this ancient partnership between human and animal. The success of the Vietnamese propaganda machine was dramatically demonstrated following the Tet Offensive of 1968, Grandfather says, his voice taking on an edge of pride. It caught US forces completely by surprise. The Tet Offensive was named for the Lunar New Year holiday, Tet, which was traditionally a time of ceasefire in Vietnamese culture. No one expected a major attack during this sacred time. The genius wasn't just in the timing, Grandfather explains. It was the scale and coordination. Simultaneous attacks across more than 100 cities and towns, including Saigon itself. Americans had been told the Viet Cong were nearly defeated, that the war was almost won. Then, suddenly, fighting erupted everywhere at once. Amidst the chaos, Viet Cong infiltrators launched an attack on the American embassy in Saigon, the very symbol of US power in Vietnam. They penetrated the compound and opened fire on the Chancery building with rocket-propelled grenades. You know what a neighbour of mine said? Grandfather smiled slightly. He had a radio and heard the news. He goes, "You're telling me these beaten ragtag guerrillas just waltzed into the most heavily guarded American building in all of Vietnam? Either the Americans are lying about winning the war, or they're incompetent. Either way, we're going to win." Although the embassy building withstood the assault, the psychological damage was done. The attack proved that not even the capital city of South Vietnam was safe from communist infiltration. The Tet Offensive also brought the reality of war to the urban population of the South, leading many to lose confidence in the Western-backed government. For us in the North, Grandfather says, it was a massive boost to morale. After years of bombing, of sacrifice, of wondering if we could ever prevail against such a powerful enemy, suddenly victory seemed possible. Midday brings another simple meal, eaten quickly in whatever shade you can find. A group of children run past playing some game involving sticks and stones. Despite the war, despite the poverty, they laugh and shout like children everywhere. Life continues even in the hardest circumstances. Not everything was about the war, grandfather says, following your gaze to the playing children. People still fell in love, got married, had babies, celebrated harvests, mourned deaths. War became the background of life, not life itself. He tells you about village traditions that continued despite the conflict, how people would gather in the communal house during Tet to pray for a good year ahead, how families still celebrated ancestors' death anniversaries with special meals and offerings, how music and folk stories provided escape from the grim realities of war. One night, he recalls, during a bombing raid, we were all huddled in a shelter. Someone started singing an old folk song about a girl waiting for her lover to return from battle. Soon, everyone was singing. The bombs were still falling, but for a few minutes, we weren't afraid. In the afternoon, as clouds gather promising rain, grandfather's story turns to the personal costs of the long conflict. He tells you about families separated for years, husbands and wives living on opposite sides of the conflict, children growing up without fathers. My own brother went south in 1954, he says softly. He believed in the Republic, thought communism would destroy Vietnam. We didn't speak for 20 years. When we finally met again after the war, we were like strangers. The rain begins, a gentle patter at first that quickly becomes a downpour. Work stops. Even rice farmers can't work in a deluge. You take shelter under the broad leaves of a banana tree, watching sheets of water transform the landscape into a blur of green and grey. Rain was both blessing and curse during the war, grandfather says, water dripping from his conical hat. It made the jungle paths muddy, difficult for American vehicles, but it also brought leeches, disease, the misery of being constantly wet. He describes the ingenious ways Vietnamese soldiers adapted to these conditions, how they waterproofed ammunition with wax and plastic, how they treated jungle rot with local herbs, how they constructed shelters that were nearly invisible from the air. The Americans called it Indian country, he chuckles. They never understood that we weren't hiding in the jungle. We were living in it. It was our home. As you wait out the rain, grandfather tells you about the psychological warfare waged by both sides. The Americans dropped leaflets promising good treatment to those who surrendered. They broadcast messages from Vietnamese defectors over loudspeakers, trying to demoralize the North Vietnamese troops. But our propaganda was more effective, he insists. We understood the Vietnamese mind better. We spoke to national pride, to history, to the dream of independence that had sustained us through 1,000 years of foreign domination. The North Vietnamese distributed their own leaflets targeting American soldiers, particularly African Americans, pointing out the irony of fighting for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home. They broadcast the voices of American peace protesters, trying to convince US troops that their own countrymen had turned against the war. One American prisoner told me years later that the most effective propaganda wasn't what we said, grandfather recalls. It was what his officers said. They kept changing the reason for the war. First it was stopping communism, then it was supporting an ally, then it was maintaining America's credibility. The soldiers started thinking, if our leaders don't know why we're fighting, why should we die for it? The rain eases, then stops. Steam rises from the warm earth, creating a ghostly mist that hovers over the fields. Work will resume soon, but for a moment there's peace in simply watching nature reclaim itself after the storm. Life in the villages was hard during the war, grandfather continues, but in some ways it was harder for the soldiers. At least we civilians could find moments of normality, planting rice, raising children, celebrating festivals. The soldiers lived with death every day. He tells you about the northern troops who marched down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of paths that wound through the mountains and jungles of Laos and Cambodia to bring supplies and reinforcements to the south, carrying heavy packs, dodging American bombs, battling malaria and dysentery. Many died before ever seeing combat. A typical northern soldier might carry 30 kilograms of supplies, he says. Rice, ammunition, medical supplies. They walked thousands of kilometers, often at night, to avoid air attacks. Some took 6 months to reach the south. The rain has stopped completely now. Villagers emerge from shelter, returning to their interrupted tasks. Children splash in puddles, women hang wet clothes to dry, men repair minor damage from the storm. The rhythm of life continues, unbroken by the temporary disruption. The war created different realities for different Vietnamese, grandfather says, leading you back toward the rice field. In remote villages like this, life went on much as it had for centuries, except for the occasional bombing raid or military sweep. In cities controlled by the South, people lived with a strange mixture of war and peace, going to cafes and cinemas while occasionally hearing explosions in the distance. He describes how people adapted to these different realities. Rural villagers became experts at constructing bomb shelters, at identifying the sounds of different aircraft, at hiding evidence of Viet Cong presence before South Vietnamese troops arrived. Urban dwellers developed their own survival strategies, knowing which areas were safe, which officials could be bribed, when to show support for the government and when to remain silent. It became normal to live with abnormal things, he says, to hear bombing in the distance while you're planting rice, to carry identification papers everywhere, to speak carefully, never knowing who might report your words to authorities. Back in the field, the work continues. The rain has made the mud softer, the air more humid, insects buzz around your head, seemingly untroubled by the human drama unfolding in their world. You work alongside grandfather, planting row after row of rice seedlings, your hands finding a rhythm in the repetitive task. People ask how we endured such a long war, he says after a period of silent work. The answer is simple. We had no choice. What was the alternative? Surrender? Accept foreign rule again? After 1,000 years of Chinese occupation, a century of French colonization and the brief but brutal Japanese period? No, whatever the cost, it had to end with us. As the afternoon wears on, grandfather tells you about the daily life of soldiers in the People's Army of Vietnam. Unlike American troops who typically served one-year tours, Vietnamese soldiers enlisted for the duration of the conflict. Many spent their entire youth at war. My neighbour's son joined at 17, he recalls, came home at 32 with grey in his hair and scars all over his body, lost 15 years of his life, never married, never had children. The war took that from him. The psychological toll was enormous. Without rotation schedules or regular leaves, Vietnamese soldiers faced constant combat stress. Some units remained in the field for years without returning to the north. They celebrated Lunar New Year in jungle camps, marked birthdays in underground tunnels, mourned fallen comrades in hasty ceremonies before moving on. And yet desertion was rare, grandfather says with evident pride. They believed in what they were fighting for, not some abstract political theory, but something they could see and touch, their homeland, their families, their future. The sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. Birds wheel overhead, returning to roost after a day of feeding. In the distance, smoke rises from cooking fires as the village prepares the evening meal. Tomorrow, grandfather says, surveying the work you've completed today, I'll tell you about the tunnels, about how an entire world existed underground while Americans searched the surface, and about how, eventually, even the mighty US military began to lose heart. As you walk back to the village, bodies tired but spirits strangely uplifted by the stories shared, grandfather falls silent, lost in memories. You wonder what he's not telling you, the personal horrors he witnessed, the losses he endured, the nightmares that perhaps still visit him decades later. The village appears ahead, a collection of simple structures that somehow withstood the mightiest military machine in human history. Children run to meet returning workers, women call out greetings, old men smoke tobacco pipes in doorways. It's a scene of profound normality that stands in stark contrast to the extraordinary history you've been hearing. This was survival at its most fundamental, not just physical survival, but cultural, spiritual, national, the determination to exist, to persist, to maintain identity in the face of overwhelming force. As you enter the village alongside grandfather, you can't help but feel a new respect for these people who refuse to disappear from history. The evening ritual begins, washing away the day's mud, preparing food, gathering as family to share the simple meal. Tomorrow brings more work, more stories, more insights into a conflict that shaped the modern world. But for now, there is rice, there is family, there is the momentary peace of surviving another day. And in that moment, you begin to understand something essential about Vietnam, not just why they fought, but how they endured. Dawn breaks differently today. The air feels heavier, the morning birds quieter, as if nature itself senses a shift in the story about to unfold. You wake with a strange mixture of dread and curiosity about what grandfather will reveal. Your muscles ache less now. The body adapts quickly when it has no choice. Breakfast is the same simple rice porridge, but there's an egg today, a small luxury that speaks to the family's generosity toward their guest. As you eat, grandfather sits beside you, his weathered hands cradling a cup of weak tea. Today, he says quietly, I'll tell you about our world beneath the earth. The walk to the fields feels shorter now that your legs know the path. Morning mist clings to the rice paddies, transforming the landscape into something ethereal, timeless. It's hard to imagine war touching this peaceful scene, yet it did, repeatedly, mercilessly. The tunnels, grandfather begins once you're both at work, were our greatest achievement, not because they were beautiful or technologically advanced, but because they kept us alive when everything above ground was trying to kill us. The tunnel systems of Vietnam were unlike anything seen in modern warfare. What started as simple hiding places gradually evolved into underground cities with sleeping quarters, kitchens, hospitals, meeting rooms, and storage facilities. The largest system at Ho Chi stretched over 200 kilometers, with parts of it just 20 kilometers outside Saigon itself. I helped dig some of the tunnels near our village, grandfather says, his hands mimicking the digging motion even as they plant rice seedlings. We used whatever tools we had, often just hands and small garden implements. The soil was removed at night and scattered in the jungle or river so American planes couldn't spot freshly turned earth. The engineering was impressive, especially considering most of the builders had no formal education. Air shafts were disguised as termite mounds or hollow tree trunks. Underwater entrances allowed people to disappear beneath the surface of streams and ponds. Booby traps protected main corridors, and secret chambers could be sealed off if sections were discovered. The hardest part wasn't digging them, grandfather explains. It was living in them. Imagine spending days, sometimes weeks, underground, the air thick with dust and smoke, no sunlight, barely enough room to sit up, let alone stand, constantly damp, always listening for American voices or machinery above. You try to imagine it, the claustrophobic darkness, the stale air, the knowledge that tons of earth could collapse at any moment. Your modern mind recoils at the thought, but for Vietnamese villagers, the alternative was worse. We had whole families down there during heavy bombing campaigns. He continues. Babies were born in those tunnels. Couples were married. People died and were buried. Life continued, just underground. A water buffalo trudges past, pulling a wooden plough that looks unchanged from centuries ago. The contrast between this ancient agricultural scene and the sophisticated tunnel networks grandfather describes is jarring. The Americans tried everything to find and destroy the tunnels, he says. They used dogs at first, but we'd leave American soap or uniforms at entrances to confuse them. They sent men called tunnel rats, small soldiers who volunteered to go into the tunnels with just a pistol and flashlight. His voice takes on a tone of grim respect. Those tunnel rats had courage, I'll give them that, crawling into the dark, never knowing what waited around the next bend. Many never came back out. The morning progresses, the sun climbing higher, beating down on your back as you work. The rhythm of planting becomes almost meditative. Reach, plant, step, repeat. In this ancient cycle of agriculture, the war years seem both distant and immediate through grandfather's stories. We booby-trapped the tunnels, of course, he continues after a while. Punji stakes, sharpened bamboo covered in excrement to cause infection, scorpion chambers, tripwires. It was terrible, but what choice did we have? It was our only advantage against their technology. You notice he doesn't glorify the violence or demonize the American soldiers. There's a matter-of-factness to his descriptions, the cold calculus of survival rather than hatred or bloodlust. The tunnels weren't just for hiding or moving around, grandfather explains. They were command centers, hospitals, factories. Women made uniforms and sandals from captured American tire rubber. Medical stations treated the wounded using whatever medicines they could find or make. Schools taught children while bombs fell overhead. He describes how the tunnels created a parallel society, one that existed literally beneath the feet of American forces. While US soldiers controlled the surface during daylight hours, at night the Viet Cong would emerge to gather supplies, tend crops, and carry out operations before disappearing again by dawn. One American general complained that they were fighting ghosts. Grandfather smiles slightly. He wasn't wrong. We appeared, struck, and vanished. The earth itself seemed to swallow us. By midday, clouds have gathered, offering blessed relief from the sun. You break for a quick lunch? Rice, again, with some fermented vegetables, and grandfather shifts his story to the American bombing campaigns. 2 years after the Americans arrived in force, he says, they expanded their bombing campaigns across North Vietnam, trying to break our will to fight. He tells you about a North Vietnamese civilian who witnessed the first B-57 bombers opening their bomb bays over his village. Rather than terror, his first thought was childlike curiosity. Why is a mother airplane dropping baby airplanes? That man survived that first attack, grandfather says. He gathered his family and ran for the nearby caves. Later, he told a journalist something I never forgot. We were really confused why the Americans tried to invade our homeland. We hadn't done anything to them. This sentiment, this genuine bewilderment at why a powerful nation from the other side of the world would rain destruction on Vietnamese villages, comes up repeatedly in grandfather's stories. For Americans, Vietnam was a war, he says quietly. For us, it was our home being destroyed. There's a difference. The work continues through the afternoon. Your hands are calloused now, your skin tanned from days in the sun. You're becoming a part of this place, this time in a way that history books could never convey. The bombing got worse over time, Grandfather continues. First it was military targets, then infrastructure, then anything that might support the war effort, which eventually meant everything. Roads, bridges, factories, power plants, even dikes that prevented flooding of farmland. The strategy, known as strategic bombing, was meant to destroy North Vietnam's ability to support the insurgency in the south, but Grandfather explains how it had the opposite effect, hardening resolve, increasing hatred of foreign intervention, and pushing more young men to join the fight. Americans never understood, he says, shaking his head. Every bomb that killed a civilian created 10 new fighters. Every village destroyed became a recruitment poster. They thought fear would make us surrender. Instead, it made us more determined. He tells you how people adapted to the constant threat from above. They dug zigzag trenches between houses so they could move around during air raids. They worked at night when bombing was less frequent. They dispersed food storage and manufacturing facilities so no single strike could cripple them. We became experts at rebuilding, he says with quiet pride. Americans would bomb a bridge, and within days we'd have a temporary one in place. They'd destroy a section of road, and we'd create a detour through the jungle. It became a game almost, them breaking things, us fixing them. This resilience extended beyond physical infrastructure to the human spirit. Grandfather describes how schools continued teaching, often in caves or forests. Doctors performed surgery by lamplight in makeshift facilities. Artists created paintings and songs that celebrated Vietnamese resistance. Life insisted on continuing, he says simply. That was perhaps our greatest victory, just continuing to live. As the afternoon wanes, Grandfather's story turns to the psychological impact of the war on both sides. He describes how Vietnamese soldiers, in many cases, had stronger resolve because they were fighting for their homeland, while many American troops struggled to understand why they were in Vietnam at all. We interviewed captured American soldiers, he recalls. Many couldn't explain their purpose here beyond vague statements about stopping communism or defending freedom. Some spoke of following orders or serving their country, but without conviction. How can you fight effectively when you don't know why you're fighting? By contrast, Vietnamese fighters had concrete, immediate motivations, protecting their families, their land, their independence after centuries of foreign domination. That's why a simple rice farmer could become a fierce fighter at night, Grandfather explains. He wasn't fighting for an ideology, he was fighting for the field we're standing in right now, for his children, for his ancestors' graves. He tells you about the psychological warfare waged by both sides, leaflets dropped from planes, radio broadcasts, propaganda campaigns. The Americans tried to convince Vietnamese civilians that the communists would bring poverty and oppression. The North Vietnamese reminded southern villagers about foreign invaders throughout their history. But the most effective messages were the simplest, he says. Ours was, they are foreigners taking our land. Theirs was, we bring modernization and freedom. In the end, people care more about who owns the land than how it's governed. As the sun begins its descent, casting long shadows across the fields, Grandfather's story turns to a pivotal moment in the war, the Tet Offensive of 1968. Though he mentioned it briefly before, now he explains its profound psychological impact on the American public and military. Before Tet, American generals kept saying victory was just around the corner, he explains. They had charts and statistics showing how many of us they'd killed, how many villages they controlled. Then suddenly we attacked everywhere at once, even the American embassy in Saigon. It shattered their narrative completely. Though the offensive was ultimately pushed back with heavy North Vietnamese casualties, the psychological victory was enormous. The American public, which had been told the war was nearly won, suddenly saw dramatic evidence to the contrary on their television screens. That was when America began to lose heart, grandfather says. Not because their military was defeated, it wasn't, but because they realized they'd been misled about the war's progress. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. He describes how the endless jungle warfare took its toll on both sides. But while the North Vietnamese remained defiant, American morale plummeted to the point where soldiers were openly ignoring orders and deserting in record numbers. Some American units developed a practice called search and avoid, grandfather says, with a hint of dark humour. They'd report they were patrolling, but actually find a safe place to rest for the day. Their commanders, often far from the fighting, never knew. As you head back to the village at day's end, grandfather points to the surrounding hills and forests. Somewhere out there are unexploded bombs, landmines, the ruins of fire-base bunkers, all slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. The war is still there, hidden but not gone. The village appears ahead, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing in the dusty central area, life continuing as it has for centuries, despite everything that tried to destroy it. Tomorrow, grandfather says, as you reach the edge of the settlement, I'll tell you how it ended, how the most powerful military in history was forced to withdraw, and what happened afterward. The story isn't what Americans think it is. That evening, as you help prepare the simple meal, you notice things you missed before. How many of the older villagers bear scars, how some are missing limbs, how conversations sometimes stop when certain topics arise. The war may be decades past, but it lives in these bodies, these memories, this land. The family gathers to eat, sharing food and quiet conversation as darkness falls. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls of the simple house. Someone plays a traditional instrument outside, its haunting melody floating through the night air. It strikes you how resilient these people are, not just physically tough, but psychologically unbreakable. Generations of Vietnamese had faced conquest, colonization, and war, yet maintained their culture, their identity, their determination to exist on their own terms. As you settle onto your sleeping mat, the sounds of the village gradually quieting around you, you find yourself wondering how the story ends. You know the broad outlines from history books, of course: American withdrawal, the fall of Saigon, reunification under communist rule. But grandfather's perspective has already shown you how incomplete, how one-sided that narrative is. Tomorrow will bring the conclusion of his story, but somehow you sense it won't be the tidy ending found in textbooks. Wars never really end for those who lived through them. They echo through time, shaping generations, landscapes, national psyches in ways both visible and invisible. Outside, a night bird calls, answered by another in the distance. The war touched everything here, yet life continued. That, perhaps, is the most profound lesson of Vietnam. Not who won or lost, but who endured. You wake to the sound of soft rain on the thatch roof. Dawn hasn't fully broken yet, but the household is already stirring. The rhythm of rural life waits for nothing. Not even daylight. Your body has adjusted somewhat to the physical demands, though your hands remain blistered and your back constantly aches. The reed mat beneath you no longer feels quite so alien. Your comfortable bed back home seems like a distant memory now. Grandfather sits by the small cooking fire, warming his hands over the flames. Something about him seems different today, a heaviness, a reluctance. You sense that the stories to come are difficult ones, even for a man who has survived so much. Today, he says quietly, as you join him, I'll tell you how it ended, and what victory really cost us. Breakfast is rice porridge again, though today there's a small piece of salt fish to share among the family, another small luxury. The rain continues as you walk to the fields, the path muddy beneath your feet. The mountains are hidden by low clouds, the familiar landscape transformed into something mysterious, almost otherworldly. By the early 1970s, grandfather begins, as you reach your work area, the endless jungle warfare had taken its toll on both sides, but while we remained defiant, US morale had plummeted. Their soldiers were openly ignoring orders, refusing missions, even attacking their own officers with grenades. They called it fragging. The rain falls steadily, soaking through your thin clothing. There's no shelter here, no respite, just as there was none during the war years. You work alongside grandfather, planting rice seedlings in the muddy water, your fingers numb with cold. Americans had a rotation system, he explains. 1 year and you go home. For us, there was no rotation. You fought until victory or death. My cousin left for the South in 1965. He didn't return until 1975, 10 years of his life given to the cause. He tells you how the American anti-war movement grew stronger with each passing year. Students protested on campuses, veterans threw their medals away, ordinary citizens demanded an end to the conflict. The war that had begun with broad public support had become deeply divisive. Your government called it the Vietnam Syndrome, grandfather says, this fear of getting trapped in another unwinnable war. But for us, there was no syndrome. There was just Vietnam, our home, our struggle, our determination to be independent after 1,000 years of foreign domination. The rain eases slightly around mid-morning, though the sky remains dark with clouds. Other villagers work nearby, everyone soaked to the skin, no one complaining. This acceptance of discomfort, this endurance, speaks volumes about the character that sustained them through decades of war. In 1969, Ho Chi Minh died, grandfather says, his voice softer. He was 79 years old and had fought his entire adult life for Vietnamese independence. First against the Japanese, then the French, then the Americans. He never lived to see the final victory. The death of Ho Chi Minh, Uncle Ho, as many Vietnamese affectionately called him, was a profound loss to the nation, but rather than weakening resolve, it strengthened the determination to fulfill his vision of a unified, independent Vietnam. After his death, we would say to each other, "Uncle Ho is watching." It became a way to remind ourselves to be brave, to be honest, to keep fighting even when it seemed hopeless. Grandfather explains how American strategy shifted under President Nixon. Unable to win militarily, the US pursued Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops while building up the South Vietnamese army to take their place. It was doomed from the start, he says, with a shake of his head. The Saigon government was corrupt to its core. Officers bought their positions, then stole their soldiers' pay. Military supplies were sold on the black market. How can an army fight effectively when its own leaders are stealing from it? At the same time, the US intensified bombing campaigns, particularly in Cambodia and Laos, trying to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail that supplied North Vietnamese forces in the south. The bombing was devastating. More explosives dropped on these countries than all bombs dropped during World War II, but it failed to cut the supply lines. Americans thought their technology would save them, grandfather says. Their planes, their bombs, their Agent Orange, but you can't bomb a people into submission when they're fighting for their homeland. Each bombing created more resistance, more determination. By midday, the rain has stopped, though the sky remains overcast. The steady work continues. There are no breaks for bad weather, no days off for political discussions. Rice must be planted, water levels maintained, fields tended. The war may have dominated Vietnamese history, but daily survival dominated Vietnamese lives. In January 1973, after years of negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, grandfather continues. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all US troops, and allowed North Vietnamese forces already in the south to remain in place. He describes the cautious celebrations in Hanoi when the agreement was announced. People wanted to believe the war might finally be ending, but decades of conflict had taught Vietnamese to be skeptical of peace treaties. Many of us thought the Americans will leave, but the fighting will continue. And we were right. The ceasefire lasted about as long as the ink took to dry on the paper. For the next 2 years, combat continued between North and South Vietnamese forces, though at a reduced level. The South, still supported by American aid but not American troops, struggled to maintain control of the countryside. Corruption and low morale plagued the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, while communist forces remained disciplined and motivated. It was like watching a boxer on his feet but swaying, grandfather says. The Saigon government was still standing, but barely. Everyone could see what was coming. In early 1975, North Vietnamese leadership made the decision to launch a major offensive. Originally planned as a 2-year campaign to gradually liberate the South, events accelerated when the initial attacks revealed just how weak ARVN resistance had become. The Ho Chi Minh campaign, grandfather says, his voice taking on a tone of pride mixed with sadness. 30 years of fighting culminated in those final months. North Vietnamese forces moved rapidly south, capturing city after city. The ARVN, despite superior equipment left by the Americans, collapsed faster than anyone expected. Soldiers deserted en masse, officers fled, entire units surrendered without firing a shot. By April 1975, we were approaching Saigon itself, grandfather says. The last Americans were evacuating frantically. You've probably seen the famous photograph of helicopters lifting off from the embassy roof as people desperately tried to climb aboard. That image, perhaps the most iconic of the entire Vietnam War, represented for Americans the humiliating end of their intervention. For Vietnamese, it meant something entirely different. For us, it wasn't about American defeat, grandfather says quietly. It was about Vietnamese victory. After more than a century of colonial domination, after millions of deaths, we were finally taking back our country. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, the symbolic heart of the South Vietnamese government. The city fell with relatively little fighting, as most ARVN units had already disintegrated. I watched it on a small black and white television in a village gathering place, grandfather recalls. When I saw that tank break through the gate, I wept, not from joy, though there was that too, but from relief. Finally, it was over. Finally, the killing could stop. The afternoon wears on. The work continues. You notice how grandfather's story has affected the other villagers working nearby. Some nod in agreement, others look away, perhaps remembering their own experiences, their own losses. The cost was unimaginable, grandfather says after a long silence. Estimates vary, but at least 2 million Vietnamese died, another 2 million wounded, countless orphans, families torn apart, villages destroyed, forests poisoned by chemical defoliants that still cause birth defects today. He tells you how Agent Orange, the American defoliant sprayed to remove jungle cover, left a legacy of cancer, birth defects, and environmental damage that continues decades later. How unexploded bombs and landmines still kill or maim Vietnamese farmers today. How the psychological scars affected a generation. After Saigon fell, or was liberated depending on your perspective, we officially renamed it Ho Chi Minh City, he continues. The country was unified under communist rule. The South Vietnamese who had worked with Americans faced harsh consequences. Re-education camps, confiscation of property, discrimination against their children. There's a complexity to his telling that you haven't heard in American accounts of the war's end. No simple triumph narrative, but a recognition of the profound human cost on all sides. "You know what's strange," he says, looking up at the clearing sky. "Even after everything they did, the bombing, the chemical warfare, the atrocities, most Vietnamese today don't hate Americans. We wanted them to leave, not to suffer. There's a difference." This ability to separate the American government's policies from the American people themselves seems remarkable given the destruction visited upon Vietnam, yet grandfather insists it's common among Vietnamese. "We had fought Chinese invaders for 1,000 years, yet we trade with China now. We fought the French for a century, yet we appreciate French architecture, cuisine, language. We fought Americans for 20 years, yet young people today wear American clothes and listen to American music." As the afternoon begins to wane, you notice the other farmers gathering their tools, preparing to head back to the village. The day's work is ending, just as grandfather's story approaches its conclusion. "The irony," he says as you walk the muddy path homeward, "is that after all that fighting in the name of communism, Vietnam today has one of the most market-oriented economies in Southeast Asia. We trade with America. American tourists visit Ho Chi Minh City. The younger generation studies English and dreams of visiting California." The village appears ahead, smoke rising from cooking fires, the day's rhythm transitioning from field work to evening activities. Children run to greet returning farmers, women call out news and gossip, old men gather to play chess with bottle caps on hand-drawn boards. "If you asked those children who Ho Chi Minh was," grandfather says, nodding toward a group of youngsters playing a game with sticks, "many wouldn't know. The war is ancient history to them. 30 years is nothing to you and me, but it's several lifetimes to a child." This generational forgetting is both natural and poignant. The defining struggle of grandfather's generation, the cause that millions died for, is fading from living memory, becoming history rather than experience. "Sometimes I wonder," he says as you reach his house, "was it worth it? All the death, the suffering, the decades of poverty that followed the war. We won independence, yes, but at what cost? It's a question without an easy answer, and grandfather doesn't seem to expect one." Instead, he sits heavily on the bench outside his home, suddenly looking every one of his 80-plus years. "The Americans never understood what motivated us," he says. "They thought it was about communism spreading across Asia, their domino theory. But for most Vietnamese, it was never about Marx or Lenin or Mao. It was about something much older, much deeper. The right to control our own destiny after centuries of foreign domination." Inside the house, the family is preparing the evening meal. The familiar smell of rice cooking mingles with herbs and a small amount of fish. Another village family has had luck fishing today and shared their bounty. These small acts of community, of shared survival, seem to embody something essential about Vietnam that helped sustain it through the darkest days. "After the war ended," grandfather continues, "we faced new struggles, economic hardship under strict communist policies, international isolation, the conflict with Cambodia, border war with China in 1979, the boat people fleeing harsh conditions and persecution. Victory didn't bring paradise, just new challenges." He describes the years of poverty that followed reunification when central planning and collective agriculture led to food shortages, how Vietnam, devastated by war and isolated by international embargoes, struggled to rebuild, how the government eventually implemented market reforms, Joy Moi, or Renovation, in the late 1980s, gradually opening the economy. Now we have tourists visiting war museums, taking pictures where bombs once fell, he says with a hint of irony. Young Vietnamese work for American technology companies. My grandchildren watch Hollywood movies. History takes strange turns. As darkness falls and oil lamps are lit inside the house, grandfather gestures for you to join the family for the evening meal. The food is simple but nourishing. Rice, vegetables, a small amount of fish, all shared equally among the household members. The conversation flows around you in Vietnamese, snippets translated by younger family members who know some English. After dinner, sitting in the soft glow of the lamps, grandfather returns to his story with a final reflection. You know, the saddest part wasn't the fighting or even the dying, he says softly. It was the misunderstanding. Americans never really knew who we were, what motivated us, and we never fully understood them either. So much death because we couldn't see each other clearly. Outside, night insects chorus in the darkness. A cool breeze carries the scent of jasmine from somewhere nearby. This moment of peace, of simple beauty, stands in stark contrast to the harsh history you've been hearing. Tomorrow, grandfather says, I'll tell you about what happened after, how a poor, war-ravaged country slowly rebuilt itself, how old enemies became trading partners, how Vietnam found its place in a changing world. You nod, already anticipating the conclusion of this remarkable oral history. But for now, there's only the soft conversation of family, the flicker of lamplight on weathered faces, the profound sense of being connected to a place and its people across time. As you prepare for sleep on your reed mat, you realize something has changed in you during these days in the village. The Vietnam War is no longer just a chapter in a history book, a collection of famous photographs, a backdrop for Hollywood movies. It has become something human, complex, lived, a struggle for national identity that stretches back centuries and continues to shape the present. The rain has returned, drumming gently on the thatch roof. Its rhythm is soothing now rather than intrusive, familiar rather than foreign. As your eyes grow heavy, you wonder what lessons grandfather's final stories will hold, not just about Vietnam's past, but about its future, and perhaps your own. Outside, in the darkness beyond the village, the landscape bears the invisible scars of war. Bomb craters long since filled, defoliated forests slowly regenerating, mass graves covered by new growth. Yet life continues, persists, refuses to be extinguished. Perhaps that more than any political ideology or military strategy is the true lesson of Vietnam. Morning comes with birdsong and soft golden light filtering through bamboo walls. Your last day in this village, this time, this history. Your body feels different now, tougher, leaner, accustomed to physical labour in a way your modern life never demanded. The reed mat beneath you no longer feels strange. Your modern bed back home seems like a distant luxury from another world. Grandfather sits outside, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. When you join him, he smiles, a gentle expression that softens the weathered map of his face. Today, he says, I'll tell you what happened after the guns fell silent. Breakfast is the same simple rice porridge, but there's a festive air this morning. Other villagers stop by, bringing small offerings, a few fresh eggs, some wild herbs, a handful of seasonal berries. Word has spread that grandfather is finishing his story today, and people want to mark the occasion. Don't mind them, he chuckles, noticing your surprise at the visitors. Vietnamese love a good story, especially one about our own history. These people lived it too, in different ways. The walk to the fields feels different today, both familiar and tinged with the bittersweetness of endings. The morning dew sparkles on rice shoots, transforming the ordinary landscape into something magical. ephemeral. After the war ended in 1975, grandfather begins, as you reach your now familiar work spot. We thought the hardest part was over. We were wrong. He explains how victory brought new challenges, reunifying two halves of a country that had developed along different paths for 2 decades. The North had embraced socialism with central planning and collective agriculture. The South had developed a market economy under American influence, with private ownership and Western cultural touches. Imagine trying to put together two halves of different puzzles, he says. That was Vietnam after 1975. The communist government extended northern systems to the south, nationalizing businesses, collectivizing farms, implementing political re-education for those who had worked with Americans or the South Vietnamese government. Hundreds of thousands of southern military officers, officials, teachers, and professionals were sent to camps where they endured harsh conditions and political indoctrination. My cousin's husband spent 3 years in re-education, says a woman working nearby, joining the conversation unexpectedly. They said he would be gone for 10 days. He came back a different man, broken somehow. Grandfather nods solemnly. There was cruelty after the victory, yes. The revolution was not gentle with those it saw as enemies. Many fled rather than face this treatment. The boat people who risked their lives on the open ocean, hoping to reach Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong. He describes how more than 1 million Vietnamese fled the country in the years following reunification. Many died at sea from starvation, thirst, or pirate attacks. Others languished for years in refugee camps. Those who eventually reached countries like America, Australia, or France formed Vietnamese diaspora communities that maintain their culture while building new lives. So we won the war, grandfather says with a hint of sadness, but lost many of our people anyway. Victory has many faces, not all of them beautiful. The economic situation deteriorated sharply after reunification. Vietnam, devastated by decades of fighting, faced international isolation and economic embargoes. The Soviet Union provided some support, but not enough to offset the immense challenges of rebuilding a shattered nation. The years after 1975 were some of the hardest, grandfather recalls. No war, but no food either. The collectives didn't work well. Farmers had no incentive to produce more than their quota. Cities faced shortages of everything: rice, meat, clothing, medicine. You work alongside him, now familiar with the rhythm of planting rice seedlings. Your hands move almost automatically, leaving your mind free to absorb his story. Around you, other farmers listen as they work, occasionally nodding or adding brief comments. This is oral history in its purest form, knowledge passed directly from those who lived it to those who need to understand. By 1978, we were fighting again, grandfather continues, this time against Cambodia's Khmer Rouge, who were attacking our border villages. We invaded Cambodia in December, drove out Pol Pot, and installed a friendly government. The world condemned us for it, but the Cambodians welcomed us as liberators from a genocidal regime. The complexity of post-war Vietnamese history unfolds through his words. How intervention in Cambodia angered China, Vietnam's historical adversary and erstwhile communist ally. In 1979, Chinese forces invaded northern Vietnam, a brief but bloody conflict that resulted in Ngo Dinh before China withdrew. So, within 4 years of peace, we had fought 2 more wars, grandfather says with a wry smile. Vietnam has never had an easy path. By midday, the sun beats down intensely. You break for a quick lunch in whatever shade you can find. A woman brings a special treat, sticky rice wrapped in banana leaves with a bit of pork inside. The simple food tastes extraordinary after a morning of hard labor. The turning point came in 1986, grandfather continues as work resumes. The government finally admitted that the strict communist economic model wasn't working. They called the new approach Joy Moi, Renovation. It allowed for private businesses, foreign investment, and individual land use rights for farmers. The results were dramatic. Agricultural production increased as farmers gained the right to sell surplus crops for profit. Small private businesses emerged: shops, restaurants, repair services. Foreign companies began to show interest in Vietnam's untapped market and low-cost labor. My eldest son opened a bicycle repair shop in the district centre, grandfather says with evident pride. Now his son runs a motorcycle dealership, 3 generations from rice farmer to business owner. That's Vietnam's story too. Through the afternoon, as clouds gather and disperse overhead, grandfather's story touches on the gradual normalization of relations with the United States. Former enemies slowly becoming trading partners in a changing world. In 1994, President Clinton lifted the American trade embargo that had been in place since the war, he explains. In 1995, we established diplomatic relations, former enemies sending ambassadors to each other's capitals. Who would have imagined it in 1968? A soft rain begins to fall, but work continues. The drops feel refreshing after the midday heat. You notice how none of the farmers complain or seek shelter. They simply adjust to changing conditions and persist. This adaptability, this endurance, seems central to the Vietnamese character that grandfather has been revealing through his stories. The most remarkable thing to me, he says, as you work side by side in the rain, is how quickly hatred faded. American veterans began returning to Vietnam as tourists. Some even met former Viet Cong or North Vietnamese army soldiers they had fought against. Often they found more in common than they expected. All were pawns in a larger game. All carried scars. All had lost friends. He tells you about a former American helicopter pilot who returned to Vietnam in the 1990s and met the anti-aircraft gunner who had shot him down. Instead of enmity, they found mutual respect. Both had been young men doing what their countries asked of them. Neither had carried personal hatred. Wars are started by governments, grandfather says quietly. But they're fought by ordinary people who might, in different circumstances, be friends. As afternoon wanes, the rain stops and brilliant sunshine returns, creating steam that rises from the warm earth. This cycle of rain and sun, hardship and relief seems to echo through grandfather's story, the rhythms of Vietnamese history, of all human experience. Vietnam today is nothing like the country I knew as a young man, he says, gazing across the fields toward the mountains beyond. Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, has skyscrapers, shopping malls, luxury hotels. Hanoi has international restaurants and fashion boutiques. Young people carry smartphones and watch American movies. Yet beneath this modern veneer, he explains, traditional values remain strong. Respect for elders, devotion to family, the importance of education, connection to the land. Vietnam has embraced economic openness while maintaining cultural continuity and political control. We learn to separate capitalism as an economic system from democracy as a political system, grandfather says. China did the same. We took what worked for us and left the rest. As the workday ends and you prepare to head back to the village, Grandfather pauses, leaning on his hoe as he surveys the fields you've helped plant. There's satisfaction in his eyes, not just for the day's labour, but for a story well told, a history preserved. "You know what the strangest part is," he says as you walk the narrow path homeward. "Despite everything, all the bombs, the chemical warfare, the millions dead, Vietnam and America are now friends of a sort. We have more positive feelings toward Americans than toward Chinese, our communist brothers who have invaded us repeatedly throughout history." The village appears ahead, golden in the late afternoon light. Children run to greet returning workers, dogs bark, smoke rises from cooking fires. This scene of rural tranquility seems timeless, yet Grandfather's stories have revealed how recently it was all threatened with annihilation. "After dinner," he says, "I want to show you something. The evening meal is special tonight. The family has prepared extra dishes to mark your last day in the village. There's fish simmered in a clay pot, vegetables stir-fried with wild mushrooms, even a small amount of pork. The luxury is relative, still simple by Western standards, but represents significant generosity." Conversation flows around the meal, family members asking about your experiences in the fields, sharing village news and gossip. Though you don't understand the language, the warmth is universal, the inclusion genuine. These people who have so little by modern measures have shared everything they have. After dinner, as darkness falls, Grandfather beckons you to follow him. He leads you to a small wooden chest in the corner of the house, removes a key from around his neck and unlocks it carefully. From inside, he withdraws a cloth-wrapped bundle. "I show this to very few people," he says, his voice low, "but you should see it after hearing my stories." He unwraps the cloth to reveal several photographs, yellowed with age, and a few small objects, a tarnished lighter, a military patch, a handwritten letter, his wartime mementos preserved through decades. "This was my unit," he says, pointing to a faded photograph of young men in simple uniforms standing before a jungle backdrop. Their faces are solemn, determined, impossibly young. Taken in 1967, before a major operation, only 3 of us survived. He shows you another photograph, himself as a young man standing beside a crude anti-aircraft gun, thin but proud in his uniform. The resemblance to his current self is there in the eyes, the set of the jaw, though the intervening decades have reshaped him entirely. "And this," he says, revealing the final photograph, "this is the American." The image shows Grandfather, perhaps in his 40s, standing beside a tall Western man in civilian clothes. They're shaking hands, expressions cautious but not hostile. "A helicopter pilot shot down near our village in 1969, Grandfather explains. "He ejected and was captured. I was assigned to guard him until higher authorities could take him to a proper POW facility. For 3 days we were together in a bunker during an American bombing campaign." He carefully rewraps the photographs and returns them to the chest. "We didn't speak each other's language, but somehow we communicated. He showed me pictures of his family. I shared my rice with him. When the bombing was especially bad, I could see he was afraid, just as I was. In those moments, we weren't enemies, just 2 humans trying to survive." Grandfather locks the chest and returns the key to its place around his neck. He came back to Vietnam in 1998, trying to find the place where he was shot down. Someone in the district centre remembered and contacted me. We met again. 2 old men instead of young soldiers. We had tea together. Neither of us mentioned the war directly. What was there to say? Night has fully fallen now. Outside, stars appear in breaks between the clouds, countless and brilliant in the absence of light pollution. The sounds of the village settling for the night drift through the open doorway. Murmured conversations, a child's laughter, a distant radio playing traditional music. Vietnam will never forget the war, grandfather says, settling onto his sleeping mat with the careful movements of age. How could we? It shaped everything about our modern nation, but we've chosen not to be defined solely by those years of suffering. We look forward now, not just backward. He gestures around the simple house, to the family preparing for sleep nearby, to the village beyond. This is the victory that matters, that we still exist, that we determine our own path, that our culture continues, not the tanks crashing through palace gates, not the political systems that come and go, but this continuity, this survival. You lie on your own mat, listening to the night sounds, absorbing the fullness of the history you've witnessed through grandfather's memories. The complexity of it all defies the simple narratives you'd previously accepted. There were no perfect heroes or irredeemable villains, just humans caught in forces beyond their control, trying to survive, to protect what they loved, to find meaning in chaos. The true lesson of Vietnam, grandfather says softly, his voice already heavy with approaching sleep, is that history is never simple, never finished. Today's enemy might be tomorrow's friend. What seems like victory might reveal itself as something else entirely. The story continues long after the battle's end. Outside, a night bird calls, answered by another in the distance. Inside, the breathing of the family grows deeper, more regular. You feel your own consciousness beginning to drift, your body surrendering to exhaustion, your mind still turning over the stories you've heard. Vietnam's story is still being written, grandfather murmurs, his voice fading, as is America's, as is yours. His final words float in the darkness like a blessing, a gentle release from the weight of history into the peace of the present moment. We all seek the same things in the end: safety for those we love, enough to eat, a place to call our own, the freedom to determine our path. Remember that, when the world tries to divide us into enemies. Remember our common humanity. The house is quiet now except for soft breathing. Through the small window, stars wheel slowly across the night sky, indifferent to borders and ideologies, to wars and peaces. The same stars that witnessed centuries of Vietnamese history, that shone down on American soldiers far from home, that continue their ancient patterns regardless of human concerns. As you drift towards sleep, the boundaries between past and present, between history and story, between this village and your modern world, seem to dissolve. What remains is a deeper understanding, not just of Vietnam or America or war, but of the complex, contradictory, resilient human spirit that both creates and transcends these categories. Your breathing slows, matches the rhythm of the sleeping family around you. The last conscious thought you have is that you'll never see Vietnam or history or conflict or reconciliation in quite the same way again. This gift of perspective, more precious than any souvenir, will travel home with you, changing how you move through the world. Outside, the night deepens. Inside, dreams begin. History rests, if only until morning. And you, listener, may now rest too. Let these stories settle gently in your mind as sleep approaches. Like the Vietnamese villagers who found moments of peace even in war, you can release the day's concerns and surrender to the healing rhythm of